Everyone tells you blood is thicker than paperwork, until your own son calls to tell you you've been evicted from a house he never actually owned, and you realize he's about to learn a lesson about paperwork the hard way. My name is Roland Absher. I'm 71 years old, and I live most of the year in a modest ranch house in Chatley, West Virginia. Though for the past 31 summers, I've spent my best months at a lake cabin on Turnbill Lake, the same porch where I taught all 3 of my kids to fish, the same dock where I still row out most mornings before the sun's fully up, even now, even with a hip that complains more than it used to. I used to believe that a father who spends 30 years building something for his family could trust that family not to try selling it out from under him. I was wrong, and it took one phone call for me to understand exactly how wrong and how badly my son had misjudged whose name was actually on the deed. Before I tell you what happened, I want to ask you something small. If you've ever had someone assume they knew more about your own life than you did, hit subscribe. It costs nothing, but it tells me you're still with me, and that matters more than you'd think. Now let me tell you about my son. His name is Denny Absher, and he's 44 years old. A man who spent the better part of the last decade convinced that being the oldest child entitled him to more say in family matters than either of his sisters, or, apparently, than me. He'd always had a smooth, confident way of talking, the kind that made salesmen and insurance agents like him instinctively and made the rest of us learn, slowly, to double-check whatever he told us. He drove a truck 2 years newer than he could really afford, financed through a dealership his father-in-law worked at, and he'd developed, over the past several years, an increasingly casual relationship with the truth whenever money was involved. Small exaggerations at first, then bigger ones, always delivered with the same easy confidence that made them hard to catch in the moment. He'd started referring to the lake cabin as the family property we're going to have to deal with eventually, a phrase that used to make my late wife Carlene wince every time she heard it, back before she passed 6 years ago. I thought I knew my son well enough to trust that whatever ambitions he had for that cabin someday, he'd never act on them without asking me first. I was about to learn how wrong that assumption was. The Tuesday it happened was about as ordinary as they come. I'd spent the morning replacing a section of dock decking that had started to rot, taken a break for lunch on the porch with a sandwich and the local paper, and was about to head back out to finish the job when my phone rang. Nothing about that morning suggested anything was coming. That's usually how it goes, isn't it? The disaster never announces itself while you're hammering nails into good cedar decking. Denny's voice on the other end had a clipped, businesslike energy I recognized from watching him negotiate car prices at dealerships over the years. "Dad, hey, so I've got some news. We sold the lake house. Closing set for Friday, so you'll need to be cleared out by then. I know it's short notice, but the buyer wanted a fast close, and honestly, Dad, it's time. That place has been a money pit for years, and none of us are getting any younger." I sat there on my porch for a long moment, holding the phone, genuinely uncertain for a moment whether I'd misheard him. "Denny, what are you talking about? I haven't sold anything." "I know, Dad. That's why I'm calling. Me and Priscilla and Vance talked it over, and we all agreed it made sense to just handle it for you, since you've been slowing down a bit, and none of us wanted you dealing with the hassle of a sale on your own. I found a buyer through a guy I know. We got a decent price, $78,000, and honestly that's more than that old place is even worth given the repairs it needs." I laughed. I want to be honest with you. In that moment, before the anger set in, I actually laughed. A short, disbelieving sound that must have confused my son more than anything else I could have said. "Denny, you forgot one thing." "What are you talking about, Dad?" "That cabin's not mine to sell. Never has been. And it sure as hell isn't yours. Here's something nobody tells you about the moment your own child tries to make a major decision about your life without asking you first. It doesn't feel like betrayal right away. It feels like confusion, a strange, dizzy sensation of listening to someone describe your own life back to you incorrectly with total confidence. And only afterward does the confusion curdle into something angrier. Denny went quiet on the other end of the line for a moment, clearly thrown by my reaction, which I imagine wasn't the grateful relief he'd been expecting. "Dad, I don't understand. You've owned that cabin since before I was born. I built that cabin with my own hands the summer your mother and I got married," I told him. "But the land it sits on, and the cabin itself, has been held in an irrevocable trust since 1998, set up by your grandfather Otis before he passed, specifically to make sure none of his grandchildren could ever pressure me into selling it or fighting over it after I'm gone. I'm not the owner, son. I'm the lifetime beneficiary. The trust owns it. And unless you found a way to get the trustee to agree to a sale, whatever paperwork you signed with your buyer isn't worth the paper it's printed on." I heard him breathing on the other end of the line, the confident, business-like energy draining out of his voice in real time. "Dad, that can't be right. I looked up the property records myself. They list you as the owner. They list the trust as the owner, Denny, with my name attached because I'm the trustee's designated life tenant. If you'd actually read the deed instead of glancing at a county website, you'd have seen that." I could hear him fumbling for words on the other end, and I felt something in my chest that was equal parts satisfaction and a deep, uncomfortable sadness that my own son had gotten far enough into selling my house without once picking up the phone to actually ask me a single question about it. "Who's the trustee?" he finally asked, and something in his voice had gone careful now, calculating. "Your Aunt Dolores," I told him. "My sister, has been since your grandfather passed. Any sale of that property requires her written approval, notarized, filed with the county. So whatever $78,000 you think you're about to collect on Friday, son, I'd start figuring out how you're going to explain to your buyer why that deal's about to fall apart. Here's something nobody tells you about the moment you realize your own child tried to profit off something that was never his to sell. The first feeling isn't rage, even though rage arrives eventually. The first feeling is a strange, hollow grief, the particular ache of understanding that your child looked at something you built with your own hands and saw, before anything else, a number. I hung up that call and sat on my porch for a long time, the half-eaten sandwich forgotten beside me, the dock repair forgotten entirely, replaying the conversation and trying to understand how my son had gotten this far without ever once mentioning it to me directly. I called my sister Dolores that same afternoon, and her reaction told me immediately that whatever had happened, it hadn't happened with her knowledge either. "Roland, I have no idea what you're talking about," Dolores said, her voice sharpening with each word. "Nobody's contacted me about any sale. Nobody's asked me for approval on anything. If Denny told a buyer that property was for sale, he did it without a single piece of paperwork that would actually hold up. I asked her to check with the attorney who'd handled the trust since Otis set it up, a man named Garrison Pell, who'd been our family's lawyer for going on 30 years, semi-retired now, but still handling the trust's affairs out of a small office above the pharmacy in town. Dolores called him that same evening, and he confirmed exactly what I'd suspected. No request for a sale had ever crossed his desk, no paperwork had been drafted, and any purchase agreement Denny had signed with a buyer was, in Garrison's precise legal language, entirely unenforceable against the trust, and potentially exposes your son to liability for fraud, depending on what representations he made to the buyer about his authority to sell. That word, fraud, sat heavy in my chest for the rest of that evening. If you've been with me a while, you know I don't move on anger alone, especially not when my own son's future is tangled up in whatever mess he's created. Before I tell you what came next, understand something. A man capable of trying to sell his own father's home out from under him, convinced enough of his own authority to actually sign paperwork with a stranger, isn't going to back down quietly just because I raised my voice on a phone call. He needed to hear it from someone with more authority than an angry father, and he needed to hear it in a way that made the consequences impossible to talk his way around. I called Garrison Pell myself the next morning and asked him to lay out, in plain terms, exactly what Denny had exposed himself to. If he represented himself as the owner or as having authority to sell trust property and signed a binding agreement based on that representation, and if he's already accepted any money, even earnest money, from a buyer under those false pretenses, that's a serious problem for him, Roland. Depending on how the buyer reacts when this falls apart, we could be looking at a civil suit against Denny personally, and potentially a fraud referral if the buyer's attorney decides to pursue it that way. My advice is, we move fast, formally, in writing, to shut this down before Friday's closing date, and we document everything, because your son may well need that documentation himself before this is over, whether he realizes it yet or not. I asked him what move fast looked like in practice. I draft a formal notice to the title company and the buyer's attorney today, informing them the seller lacked authority to convey the property, that the trust does not consent to the sale, and that any closing attempted Friday would be void from the start. That protects the property immediately. What we do about Denny after that is a separate question, and one I think you need to sit with before deciding. I want to be honest about what that week cost me. Sitting with the knowledge that my own son had gone this far, contacting a buyer, negotiating a price, signing an agreement, all without a single conversation with me, took something out of me that I don't think fully came back, even after everything settled. I didn't sleep well that week, lying awake running through 30 years of summers at that cabin, wondering when exactly Denny had started seeing it as an asset to liquidate, rather than a place his own children had learned to swim. Garrison's notice went out Wednesday morning, and by Wednesday afternoon, I got a call from a man named Curtis Yancey, the buyer Denny had lined up, who sounded genuinely rattled by what he'd just learned from his own attorney. "Mr. Absher, I want you to know I had no idea there was any issue with the title. Your son represented himself as the sole owner, showed me documents with your name on them, told me the sale had full family agreement. I put down $15,000 in earnest money based on that." I told Curtis I believed him, and I meant it. He sounded like a man who'd been misled just as badly as I had, in a different direction. I told him Garrison would be in touch to make sure his earnest money was returned promptly, and that whatever dispute existed here was between me and my son, not between me and him. Denny called that same evening, his voice a strange mixture of defensive and panicked in a way I'd genuinely never heard from him before. "Dad, Curtis is saying he wants his earnest money back, and he's talking about getting a lawyer involved. What did you do?" "What did I do?" I said, and I let a long silence sit on the line before I continued. The same kind of silence he'd made me sit through, waiting for an explanation 2 days earlier. "Denny, I had my attorney inform the title company and Curtis's attorney that you never had authority to sell that property, because you don't. That's not something I did to you, son. That's the truth, catching up to something you did. Dad, we all just wanted to help you. You're 71. You can't keep maintaining that place forever. We figured. You figured wrong on every count," I said, cutting him off, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "You figured wrong that I couldn't maintain it. You figured wrong that it was yours to decide. And you figured wrong that I wouldn't find out exactly how far you'd gotten before I put a stop to it. I want you to understand something clearly, Denny. I am not angry that you think I should eventually let that place go. I am angry that you decided that on your own, signed papers with a stranger, and called to inform me I had until Friday to be evicted from a home I've owned longer than you've been alive. Here's something nobody tells you about the days following a discovery like this. The anger doesn't stay simple. It tangles up with grief, and eventually, if you let it, something closer to clarity about who your children actually are underneath the roles you'd assigned them in your own head for years. My daughters, Priscilla and Vance. Yes, Vance. my late father-in-law's name, a family tradition my wife insisted on for our youngest girl, called separately once word got around, both horrified, both insisting they'd had no part in whatever Denny had arranged and hadn't even known he was pursuing a sale until he mentioned it to them almost as an afterthought, framing it, according to both of them, as something already essentially decided rather than something he was asking their opinion on. "Dad, he told us it was basically already handled," Priscilla said, calling from her home 2 states away, her voice tight with anger of her own. "He made it sound like you'd already agreed, like we were just being looped in for logistics. I should have called you directly the second he mentioned it, instead of assuming he'd actually talked to you first." I sat with that information for a few days, understanding that Denny hadn't just misjudged his own authority over the trust, he'd actively misrepresented the situation to his own sisters, using their assumed agreement to make the whole plan look more settled and legitimate than it ever actually was. The same way he'd apparently misrepresented his authority to Curtis Yancey to close the deal quickly before anyone could ask too many questions. I did not cut Denny off entirely, not right away, though God knows plenty of people in my position might have. I understood, working through it slowly with Dolores and with Garrison's steady, patient counsel, that whatever consequences Denny faced needed to come from the actual structure of the trust and the actual law, not from an emotional decision I made in the heat of the worst week of anger I'd felt toward my own son in 44 years. Garrison and Dolores, as trustee, moved to formally document what had happened. Denny's unauthorized representation to a buyer, his acceptance, on my behalf without authority, of preliminary buyer contact and negotiation, and crucially, a paper trail showing he'd told his sisters the sale was essentially finalized when it had never been anything more than his own unilateral decision. Dolores, exercising her authority as trustee, formally amended the trust's operating documents to require, going forward, that any future decisions about the property, sale, major renovation, anything material, require unanimous written consent from all 3 of my children plus my own sign-off, while I remained the life tenant, closing the exact loophole of assumed authority Denny had tried to exploit. If this story has meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you hit subscribe before we go on. It helps keep stories like this going, and it means more to me than you'd know, knowing there are people listening who understand what it feels like to have someone you raised assume they knew your life better than you did. The Friday that was supposed to be my eviction date came and went with nothing happening at all. The closing formally cancelled 2 days prior once Curtis Yancey's attorney confirmed the title issue and pulled out entirely. His earnest money returned in full within the week. No hard feelings on his end once he understood he'd been misled just as thoroughly as I had. I spent that Friday morning exactly the way I'd planned to spend it before Denny's call ever came in. Out on the dock, finishing the last section of rotted decking, the lake calm and silver in the early light, the same water I'd taught all 3 of my children to swim in, the same porch where Denny himself had once caught his first base, at age 9, grinning so wide I thought his face might split, a version of my son I hadn't thought about in years until that quiet Friday morning brought him back to me, unbidden. Denny showed up that afternoon, unannounced, standing at the bottom of the dock steps for a long moment before he came the rest of the way down, looking older somehow than he had just a week earlier. "Dad," he said, and his voice had none of the clipped, businesslike confidence I'd grown so used to over the years. "I need to say I'm sorry, and I need you to actually believe I mean it, not just because it fell apart and I got caught." I set down the hammer and looked at my son for a long moment, weighing 30 years of summers against one terrible week, weighing the boy who'd caught his first base off this same dock against the man who'd tried to sell it out from under me without a single phone call. "You didn't forget one thing, Denny," I finally said. "You forgot the only thing that actually mattered, that this was never just a piece of property to sell. It was the one place I always assumed all 3 of you would fight to keep, not fight over who got to sell it first." Denny sat down heavily on the dock steps, put his face in his hands, and for the first time since he was a boy, afraid of losing a fish off the line, I watched my son actually cry, and I found myself, despite everything, sitting down beside him, the same way I had 35 years earlier, waiting to see if there was still something worth teaching him.